رؤية جديدة من التنقيبات الأثرية في موقع وادي شرمة رقم 1. حجاز Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, new insight from the excavations at Wadi Sharma 1. Professor Fuji, please start. You got 15 minutes.
Should I open this one? That's right. No. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I would like to talk about Wadi Sharma 1, a small Neolithic settlement near the Red Sea coast, and briefly discuss its archaeological implications in a broader context. Well, before entering the main subject, let me outline our comprehensive research project. As some of you might know, we have long been working in these three inland arid terrains, the Bishri Mountain Range in central Syria, the Jaffa Basin in southern Jordan, and our new target, Tabuk, Jolf provinces in northwestern Arabia. With a view to tracing the process of pastoral normalization or the formation process of the barrier society in the dry heartland of the Near East. Toward this goal, we have excavated many sites ranging in date from the PPNB, Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, when sheep and goat were first domesticated, to the early Bronze Age, when full-fledged nomadic society established, based on tribalism is supposed to have been established. In the Bishri Mountain Range, for example, we excavated a Kiamian PPNB composite site, Wadi al-Hajjana 1, and traces the process of diffusion process of initial Neolithic culture from the central part of the Fertile Crescent. Likewise, in the Jaffa Basin in southern Jordan, we excavated a few Neolithic sites, including the PPNB agro-pastoral outpost of Wadi Abu Traiha, and traces the process of pastoral normalization derived from the southern edge, in this case, southern edge of the Fertile Crescent. Well, our new project in Saudi Arabia also started with the same objective. We surveyed the northern part of the Tabuk province in search of Neolithic site and visited Wadi Sharma, found some 30 years ago by the Comprehensive Archaeological Survey Program. We soon noticed its archaeological potential and decided to embark on a full-scale investigation. Our Saudi-Japan joint excavation started in December 2013 and was successfully completed, alhamdulillah, with the fourth season in December 2015. Taking this opportunity, I wish to express our sincere gratitude to the full cooperation of SUKS and many Saudi-friendly colleagues shown in these photos. Now, let us move on to the main subject. In terms of topography, the site is located on the southern slope of an isolated hill on the north bank of Wadi Sharma. It's about 30 kilometers upstream of the Red Sea coast, where a small town, Sharma, exists. We set up 3 operation areas along the ridge of the gentle slope. The excavation revealed a small, elongated settlement with a total area of about half hectare. Let me show you some slides, area by area. But this is a general view of Area 3, the southernmost operation sector. Two complexes, area complex 1 and complex 2, are included in this area. Both complexes consist of semi-subterranean, round to oval masonry structures oriented to the southeast or southwest. Area 2 also contains two complexes, complex 3 and 4, both of which are composed of ground type, not subterranean, ground type, somewhat angulated units, oriented again to the southeast or southwest. Meanwhile, Area 1, the northernmost one, contains a single well-organized complex, complex 5, which centers on ground type square to rectangular, centers on the ground type square to rectangular unit oriented exclusively to southwest. A dozen C14 data and the typological sequence suggested above indicate that the elongated settlement started with the southernmost complex and then gradually shifted, not developed, shifted northward. The small find, so it would follow that the settlement at one time during its occupational history was limited to one or at least a few complexes. So if so, the settlement population is estimated about several dozens only. The small finds from the settlement are limited in both number and variety, which is suggestive of the involvement of a small-scale, probably high mobility population group. As is shown in this value, even flint and calcite artifacts are scarce considering the extensive excavation area, totaling some 700 only. Well, the detail, let me skip the detail of the assemblage. Anyhow, the assemblage is characterized by the predominance of amuk-type point and thick braids. But meanwhile, the groundstone assemblage is marked by the combination of small flat cairns and round to oval grinding slabs, both made of sandstone. Other stone products include miniature vessels, whetstones, and shaft straighteners. Of interest is a flint bowlet, small flint container, found in Area 1, about which I will explain later in more detail. In addition, the settlement yielded a small, certain number of shell snail ornaments. Discussion. The first issue, the dating of the settlement, is easy to approach. Both the flint assemblage represented by the amuk-type point and the series of C14 data demonstrate that the settlement dates back to the second half of the 8th millennium Cal BC, that is, the late PPNB of the Levantine chronology. It follows the site is roughly contemporary with many Neolithic PPNB sites in southern Jordan, including Wadi Abdullah mentioned at the beginning. As for the subsistence strategy, available evidence suggests that a small settlement was sustained by hunting, agriculture, and probably herding of livestock. It appears, however, that the exploitation of marine products were limited despite the advantageous site location. The next issue is seasonality of the settlement. Of interest in this regard is the custom of entrance ceiling recognized throughout the settlement, which suggests the settlement was emptied on a seasonal basis, or to put it the other way around, used only on a seasonal basis. This reminds us of the settlement patterns in the neighboring Jaffa Basin in southern Jordan, as with the case Wadi Abu Turayha. Wadi Sharma I might have been used as a winter camp of initial pastoral transhumans, making a round trip between the outpost, small outpost in the lowland, and the parent settlement in the highland. The final question is the relationship with the South Levantine PPNB. It is well known that the South Levantine PPNB has a double-layer structure, a central PPNB under the Mediterranean climatic regime, and the marginal PPNB, including Jaffa Basin and the Sinai Peninsula. It appears that the Wadi Sharma is located still outside the marginal PPNB. However, the predominance of the Amg-type point is shared among these sites, suggesting that Wadi Sharma I belonged to the cultural sphere of the South Levantine PPNB. It is noteworthy, however, the assemblage is dominated by changeable orientation freight cores, and unlike Wadi Abu Turayha and Kilowa, devoid of Navihome core and braid technique, ubiquitous to the Levantine PPNB. Taking this into consideration, it is more likely that the Wadi Sharma flint assemblage consists of two distinct groups. One, first, a local product, such as irregular flake core and tools made of low-quality flint. And second, high-quality trade goods, represented by the Amg-type point. This eclectic character of the flint assemblage might reflect the fact that no high-quality flint nodules is available in the northwestern Arabia.
2 minutes.
Well, another link with the southern Levantine PPNB is the flint bollard mentioned above. This unique stone vessels or ritual palette is produced taking advantage of the natural shallow depressions of a cortical flint slab, and common to many late PPNB settlements in southern Levant. The occurrence of this unique artifact also indicated that the Wadi Sharma I was incorporated into the trade network of South Levantine PPNB and possibly shared a similar ritual with its contemporary site. The same is roughly true with structural remains. As you can see here, it appears a techno-typological sequence of Masonry structures at Wadi Sharma I accord well with the general trend in the southern Jordan from the end of the middle PPNB to the late PPNB. The similarity ranges over minor aspects as well. Among others, noteworthy is a wall slit for a wooden pillar. There is little doubt that this unique technique derived from Beda type site of the southern Jordanian PPNB or Beda type settlement in southern Jordan. Conclusion, increasing evidence has enabled us to incorporate the neolithization process in northwestern Arabia into the chronological framework of South Levant. Now, this new perspective is expected to open a new horizon for the Neolithic study in the Near East, but many issues remain to be discussed. We'd like to continue our effort for a better understanding of the archaeological potential for of the Arabian Peninsula. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Fuji. And I invite Dr. Paul Breeze to present his paper entitled The Mapping of 10,000 Lakes and River Systems Across Saudi Arabia.
So the title is actually slightly different, but it doesn't matter. We are covering those lakes and river systems, so hopefully people won't be disappointed. I'm a postdoctoral researcher on the Paleo Deserts project. I've been working on the Paleo Deserts project now for 5 years, and having just talked about the Neolithic, we're now going to go back in time. We're going to look at the Paleolithic. And I'm going to give you a very brief overview of some of the highlights of some of the work that we've been doing over the last 5 years, looking at paleo environments and prehistory in Saudi Arabia and in the peninsula as a whole. So we're a multidisciplinary team. We're composed of collaborators and researchers from numerous institutions across the globe and from here in Saudi, including King Saud University and Hal University. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank His Royal Highness Prince Sultan bin Salman and the Saudi Commission for Tourism and National Heritage for arranging this conference and for their continued support for our fieldwork in Arabia. And I'd like to also thank the Saudi Commission in Tourism for National Heritage, the Saudi Geological Survey and Saudi Aramco for all of their support and all of their help with the work that we're doing. All of the stuff I'm showing today wouldn't be possible without them. So it's an interdisciplinary project, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the aspects of that I've been most closely involved with, which are using satellite imagery to integrate and examine the environmental records, and also about the landscape distribution of some of the archaeology we've been finding. So we've been fortunate now to have been able to work in numerous different locations across the kingdom, and this is really fantastic because it gives us a chance to look at the spatial changes in the archaeological and environmental record as well as the temporal ones. And of course, Arabia today is very arid, as typified by this climate map by Dr. Richard Jennings, with only the southern portion of the peninsula receiving more rainfall from the monsoons. But we've known for a long time that this wasn't always the case in the past. So the work of such researchers as Harold McClure and many other early researchers showed that if you went into the deserts, you could actually find the presence of old Paleolake deposits. And we've also known for a long time that there's a widespread distribution of lower and middle Paleolithic archaeology in the kingdom. So the maps in the middle there are mostly composed of the results of the comprehensive survey as published in Atlal, which showed that there were hundreds of surface sites across the kingdom. But because these were surface sites, they weren't datable, and as a result, the kingdom and Arabia has been largely sidelined until very recently in many of the discussions about some of the most important questions in terms of early human prehistory and also the dispersals of species out of Africa. But from about 2010, we had the first dated sites in Arabia, and that started to show that we could actually get some really important information about those topics from Arabia. So we had 3 sites reported between 2010 and 2011. We're probably up to about a dozen now, including unpublished ones that we've got in the works, stratified datable sites. So the first dated site in Arabia, securely dated site in the kingdom, that is, was from Juba, where we dated paleolakes, and associated archaeology back in 2011. And around about the same time, the work of Tom Rosenberg and others in the kingdom was showing that you could find these paleolakes and investigate them using modern OSL techniques rather than the radiocarbon techniques that have been used previously, and in this manner start to reconstruct when these more humid phases had actually occurred. And so when we talk about green Arabia periods, what are we talking about? Well, essentially due to the orbital variations of the Earth, at certain periods there are variations in the amount of radiation that is received by the surface of Saudi Arabia and places such as the Sahara, and the effect of this is actually it pulls the monsoons further north. So Arabia received monsoon rains, and the results of recent climate models like this one by Dr. Richard Jennings, this is a map for 130,000 years ago, the start of MIS5E, the last interglacial. That's a period we're going to talk about quite a bit. And what these are showing is that actually it's the East African monsoon that is responsible for most of the contribution rather than the Indian Ocean monsoon, as previously thought. Now, why is this important? Well, we've known for a very long time that the earliest fossils of our own species are all in Africa. So we've known that people were in East Africa by around 200,000 years ago. Earlier this year, that date got pushed back, so we now know that people were in Northwest Africa by around about 300,000 years ago. And by 100,000 years ago, this is an important time because this is the first time that we see people out of Africa, Homo sapiens that is, in the Levant immediately to the north of Arabia. But for a long time, this has been largely assumed to be a failed dispersal. And a key question has been, did these people get any further? It's largely been, often models have assumed they didn't. But recent evidence from genomics suggesting that there may be an early contribution to our gene pool from an earlier dispersal, and also recent fossil discoveries in China are suggesting that might not be the case. So we have Homo sapiens, teeth that are attributed to Homo sapiens in China around about 100,000 years ago again. And the Southeast Asian record keeps getting pushed older progressively over time. So there is a suggestion that people may have got out of Africa earlier. And Arabia, sorry, I'll just skip back. Arabia and the Sahara, well, that's fine. Arabia and the Sahara have a key role in investigating this because the desert forms a barrier. So if we can understand the changing nature of that barrier, we might be able to say something about these dispersals. And in the Sahara, that's been shown to be the case. So this is a map by Professor Nick Drake of the lakes and the rivers of the Sahara. And what has been shown here is that the archaeology appears to follow freshwater corridors through the desert during a green Sahara period about 125,000 years ago. And the structure of the archaeology investigated by Eleanor Sherry has also shown this. But in Arabia, we haven't quite been able to do that in the past because these are excellent stepping stones towards being able to do that. These are early maps of Arabian paleo drainage from the Quaternary period in Saudi Arabia volume. But we needed to add to these to make them multiscalar, to make them digital and quantitative so we could examine them in more detail. And also, critically, we need to understand where paleo lakes were. And these maps, we didn't have a map of where paleo lakes were across the whole peninsula. So this is important because Paleolithic deposits provide a really excellent environmental and archaeological resource. We can date them using modern geochronological methods. We can investigate their microfauna and chemistry and start to learn about the environments around them. We can also do this by looking at fossils that are around these lakes or embedded within them, and they often have stone tools embedded within them or around them. So this makes them really important for building a framework of understanding climate and human occupations in Arabia, but to do that we've got to be able to find them. And so this was a problem I approached for my PhD thesis. So I developed a method for mapping the location of Paleolithic deposits using satellite imagery and using radar imagery from the space shuttle missions, combining them in a GIS using geomorphological rules. And I'm not going to get into technical details today on that, and that's all previously published. So obviously this is what Arabia looks like today, but if we just overlay all of the rivers and lakes that we've mapped, it starts to look something more like this. So a green Arabia with many rivers and lakes. And if we look at that map in more detail, these are all of the major paleo drainage courses that we've mapped, and also all of the paleo lakes. So there's a minimum of 8,000 here. Actually, many of these basins, we've seen evidence, and you'll see it later, that there are multiple periods where lakes form in them, so that's a minimum estimate. And there's over 77,000 individual deposits that have been classified to produce this map. So what can we do with this information? Well, I'm going to zoom in now as an example on the Western Nufud Desert. This is an area we've worked now for about 4 years, and this is a map of all of the locations of the Paleolithic deposits across it, about 700 on that map. And we've been driving out to these with the Saudi Commission for Tourism and National Heritage, and we've also been flying out to them with the Saudi Geological Survey. And this has been crucial because this has allowed us to get deeper into the desert than ever before and start to examine these deposits in more detail. And we've been working with the Saudi Geological Survey, who are helping us examine the paleontology of these deposits, and you're going to hear about that next. So what do we do when we actually find them? Well, we sample them for dating and for environmental analyses. We investigate the areas around them to look, and within them to see if we can find stone tools, and the same for fossils. And this is an image that typifies this environment today. This is an image from the Western Nufud Desert. But our data is suggesting this is more like what we may have seen during some of the Green Arabia periods. And actually, the dunes there would have been vegetated with savanna grasses as well. So interdunal lakes with grasses and shrubs and trees around them. And these are spoilers for the next talk. We also know there were large mammals there. So the findings of the Saudi Geological Survey and ourselves are showing that there's interesting large mammals there. You're going to hear more about this next and what this means for these lakes and for the environments of the Western Nufud. But if we look at the changing distribution of archaeology over time, we can start to make some tentative examination of this now, because we have surveyed these different regions. So if we look at the Lower Paleolithic, we see quite a lot of Lower Paleolithic material, distributed though more towards the edge of the dune field. We don't see many major sites towards the interior, and that's even though we have dated paleo lakes that fall within this very broad timescale further in that we've also investigated. And these are the kinds of stone tools that we find around these earlier paleo lakes. And if we move forward in time to the Middle Paleolithic, we start to see a wider spread distribution of these Paleolithic the archaeology, and it's also, we're finding it more widely associated with these Paleolithic deposits, partly, of course, due to preservation, but we start to find some really interesting things. So these are some of the stone tools that we might find associated with these as we've been looking at it. This is an example of one of these sites, and this is a really spectacular site which is in preparation for publication at the moment, which we call CAM 4. And each of those grey areas you can see there is a Paleolithic deposit. So we've now dated these with optical stimulated luminescence, and we know that a Paleolithic formed here about 400,000 years ago, another one formed 300,000 years ago, another one 200,000 years ago, yet again 125 to 115,000 years ago, the last interglacial, and again 55,000 years ago. So we see the repeated formation of paleolakes in this desert at multiple periods over time. These are multiple Green Arabia periods coinciding with interglacials, and also the later one with a minor humid event in MIS3. And critically, we see archaeology associated with every single one of these Green Arabia periods. So people are here during each of these events. Most likely earlier species such as Homo erectus with the earlier ones, and then the later may include Homo sapiens, and we'll see more about that later. But so far, we don't have any evidence for people being here between those green events. So when Arabia is arid, at the moment, we have no evidence for human occupation. There may be the possibility of refugia, but that's still something we need to investigate. At the moment, we don't have any secure evidence for the population surviving between humid periods. So if we come back to this big question of our own dispersal out of Africa, we've got people in the Levant 100,000 years ago. If we integrate the paleohydrological mapping with the environmental record, if we have dated paleolakes within a catchment, then we can say that that catchment was at least episodically or periodically active. There was activation of the drainage systems within it. We know there are lakes within it, and that the other lakes in that catchment were likely also active. And when we do this, we can start to see some interesting things. So this is a minimal estimate. This is just based on the available paleoenvironmental data, but we can start to show that there was probably a connected corridor to the Levant from Arabia, and there were likely more than this. I personally believe that this is not the only such corridor, but it's the only one we can demonstrate at the moment. As I said, we know that people are in the Levant 100,000 years ago, so environmentally they had an opportunity to get into Arabia, as did animals. Did they take it? Well, yes, they did. So we now have found a Homo sapiens fossil in the Nufud Desert. This is has been submitted now and is currently in review. And we have got direct dates from this finger bone and from the material which we found it with, showing that this was dating to 85,000 years ago. So Homo sapiens did get into Arabia. They did get further than the Levant at that time. And when we look at the climate modelling, this is again from Dr. Richard Jennings, integrated with the paleohydrological data, and we're currently working this up with other paleoenvironmental data as well for publications. It starts to suggest that this was not necessarily an isolated event. There were potentially widespread opportunities for people to spread through Arabia during this last interglacial and the humid periods within it, and potentially to move from Arabia out further into Southwest Asia or back into Africa as well. So there's a lot of complexity here. We're seeing multiple opportunities for dispersal and a lot of complexity with those. And to go with this, we're also now working across the wider Sahara-Arabian Desert Belt, again, refining paleohydrological mapping. So we're actually updating the stuff in the Sahara. This is old data for the Sahara, but we're doing this in higher resolution. So we can start to examine the changing, the nuances and the changes over time in potential environmental opportunities for people to move through the desert belt. So what does all of this mean? Well, it brings Arabia really front and central, as many people have already said during this conference, to investigating these important questions about our own species and the dispersal of other species. So we now know that we have Homo sapiens in Arabia 85,000 years ago. People got at least this far during the last interglacial. They had the opportunity to get further. Various data sets are now suggesting they probably did. So just coming back to this, the kingdom is really central to understanding these roots, the character and the demography of early dispersals. And we've started to be able over the last few years, and this isn't just the work of our project, multiple projects have been working on this kind of thing, to build a framework, an environmental and an archaeological framework to start to be able to examine questions in more detail. But we need to continue to do this. So critically, we need to be able to continue to find these deposits that we can date, and we need to examine them in a multidisciplinary manner. And it's a really exciting time to be working in Arabia and to be working on this. So thank you very much. And this is our website, should you wish to visit it.
Thank you very much. I invite now Dr. Matthew Stewart to present his paper. 15 minutes.
Thanks, Abdullah. Sorry. So my name's Matthew Stewart, and like Paul before me, I'm part of the Paleo Deserts project. Today I'm going to be talking to you primarily about the paleontological aspect of things. And so it's going to be focusing on the Pleistocene remains from the Western Foot Desert, which Paul talked in length about. So I'm going to discuss some of the animals that we're finding, the types of animals, what this might mean for the paleo environment and paleo ecological reconstruction. And then I'm also going to briefly talk about some new and kind of exciting evidence for early humans in the Western Foot Desert over the past couple of 100,000 years. So this is just a satellite image of the survey area in the Western Foot Desert. You can see Tamar marked with the blue dot there. Each one of these black circles and red triangles represent a fossil-bearing locality. So as you can see, there's no shortage of them, and there's bound to be plenty more. We just need to find them. The big difference is the red triangles are simply just the major fossil-bearing sites, so the ones that have produced the most fossil material, and the majority of the material I talk about today comes from these localities. So if you turn to the figure on the right, it's a chronology of the sites, and basically it's just highlighting that the majority of the fossil-bearing sites that we have so far are dated to the humid phase of MIS 9, and so that's around 300,000 years old, and also MIS 5, so about 100,000 years old. And I just want to stress that the majority, if not all of those sites, all of those black dots and red triangles, have associated archaeology in the form of lower and middle Paleolithic tools. So basically, wherever we go and we find fossils, we tend to find archaeology associated with it as well. And as Paul just mentioned, and this has been sort of one of the major themes throughout this conference, is this Green Arabia, and the Western Foot Desert was no exception. Over the past 500 or so thousand years, drastic increases in humidity and precipitation resulted in the establishment of these permanent rivers and lake systems. So we know that from oh sorry Paul, that was meant to be changed to 700, mate. We know that from the paleo-environmental record, but what is the fossil record telling us? Do we see a corresponding shift in the faunal composition following these increases in water availability? So let's look at the idea of large permanent rivers and lakes first. Well, quite interestingly, probably the most common taxa that we're finding are hippos. We've got them at about 6 sites now, spanning about 300 to about 80,000 years old. Now, hippos are great paleo-ecological indicators as they both live and breed in water. And furthermore, they're quite sensitive to dry, arid conditions. They dehydrate very easily, and they basically just do not survive. And as a result of this, their range is typically restricted within about 3 kilometres of permanent lakes and rivers. So what can this information tell us about hippo dispersals and the Western Foot Desert? Well, if a hippo's range is restricted within about 3 kilometres of a permanent water source, its dispersal to a adjacent lake requires that lake be within about 3 kilometres of the original lake, and so on. So if you're finding the hippos in the Western Foot Desert, that suggests that at times there were these paleo-hydrological corridors leading into the Western Foot Desert, so these chains of lakes. Furthermore, like I said, we have these at 6 different sites, spanning 300,000 to about 80,000 years old, so that incorporates multiple wet and drying phases. So that tells us that this dispersal event of hippos into the Western Foot occurred at multiple times, and by inference, these hydrological corridors as well, at numerous times over the past few 100,000 years. Some other animals that are strongly associated with water include things like these water birds, dabbling ducks and grebes. These guys tend to nest and live in the heavily vegetated areas of that surround lakes and rivers. And also the bandicoot rat, which inhabits sort of similar environmental conditions. Now, Thomas, back in 1998, in his first reporting of the paleontological record from Tisalgada, which is a site that's dated to about 300,000 years old, although it's possibly older, reported remains of a ray-finned fish, and he estimated this fish to be about a metre or so in length. So it's quite clear looking at this taxa and the hippo as well that there most definitely was these permanent water sources, and in fact they were really quite productive. I mean, they're attracting water birds and they've got fish occupying them, so basically these lakes are very alive. Now, expansive grasslands. We have numerous occurrences of elephant, ranging from about 300,000 years, but again that site is possibly older, up until about 100 or so thousand years old. Now, we know that modern elephants, in particular the African elephant, is a mixed feeder, taking in both grass and shrub. But there is some evidence looking at the dental wear of Middle Pleistocene elephants, including things like the Paleoxodon, that these taxa sort of focus more on grazing, so eating grasses. Now, I had some images here of what I thought were really cool, the fossils from Tisalgada, but the SGS team decided to bring them all here, so we won't dwell on that. So during our last field trip, we actually discovered some some evidence for elephants from fossilized footprints. So we stumbled across this inverted paleolake feature, which you can see up there in the top left in the interdural depression, and that's sort of what it looks like as you get a little closer. Now, when we climbed on top of this, we discovered that on top there were hundreds of these really well-preserved footprints, and the most impressive of these are some of these elephant ones. You can see on the left there a bit of an elephant trackway. Now, we're lucky enough that there was a stratigraphic layer overlying the main the main footprint-bearing unit, and we're able to date these using OSL to around 113 to 120,000 years. Now, if you can take the length measurements of these footprints and plot it against the known shoulder height, which in this graph is the x-axis, and the footprint length, which is the y, for African elephants, which are represented by the black dots. Now, when you plot in the lengths of the footprints from our footprint site, it's clear that the printmakers, these elephants, were significantly larger than the modern African elephants. Now we're not sure, what species made this, although we know that things like the Paleoxodon was in the order of 1.5 times larger than modern African elephants, so possibly something like that. But what we can say is that when you have an increase in body mass, you have an increase in metabolic rate, and therefore you need to intake more food. Now, if we consider that and the idea that these elephants may have been specialising more so in graze compared to modern African elephants, you can start to build a picture of a really substantial plant biomass, and in particular a grass biomass in the Western Nufut Desert at times during these humid phases. We also have a large bovid known as a Pelarovis. This was the largest bovid to have ever lived. We found this at 5 different sites, spanning 420 to 80,000 years old. Now this taxa here was a specialist grazer. One way you can tell is by the high crown tooth. So on the right there we have a molar specimen from one of our sites, 16_1, and you can see that the crown is really quite high. Now, specialising in grazing is really quite taxing on teeth. It wears teeth down very fast, so animals that specialise in grazing are required to have these very high crowned teeth. In addition to that, we have found hartebeest and roan antelope at 2 different sites, one of which is undated, which is the 16_25 site, but that's just an example of a nice horn core. Both of these taxa are specialist grazers. In particular, the hartebeest up the top is almost exclusively a grazer. It subsists almost 100% on grass. And both of these, unlike the Arabian endemic, the Arabian oryx, which can get most of its moisture, or all of its moisture from food, both of these taxa are required to need access to drinking water every couple of days to survive. So with an influx of these large herbivores, you would expect a corresponding influx of carnivores, and we see this. We have small carnivores such as mustelids and foxes, as well as some larger ones like the African golden wolf up in the top right, spotted hyena, top left, and also an extinct Eurasian jaguar as well. So looking at this taxa alone, it tells us 2 key things. One, it strongly supports those paleo-environmental findings that we have these large permanent rivers and lake sources, as well as these expansive grasslands. And in addition, it tells us that we're having an influx of taxa from both Africa and Eurasia during these wetting periods. Now, if we look closely at the fossil material, we begin to see evidence of butchery activity. Now, this is, to me, this is exciting for two main reasons. One, because it's the oldest type of this evidence in the Arabian Peninsula to date, and also butchery evidence can provide a unique insight into human behaviour and ecology that stone tools alone cannot. The analysis is still preliminary, and the evidence isn't very abundant, so I'm not going to draw any major conclusions from them, but I will run through some examples. So here we have some cut marks from Tissalgada, and again this is dated to probably 300,000 years old or older. On the left you can see three parallel cut marks. They're V-shaped. They have the typical microstriations that run along the inside, and in fact there's two more, but then they're not, that run parallel to this, but they're not quite in the photo. And again on the right-hand side you can see another cut mark there. We also appear to have what seems to be some evidence of hammerstone percussion. So this is when humans break open long bones using stones to gain access to the nutritious marrow on the inside. And here is just some more examples from the same site, but from a stratigraphical position that's slightly lower, and we have an abundance of this type of evidence there. Like I said, I'm not going to draw any major conclusions, but as this evidence builds, it should provide a unique insight into resource availability to these early humans, and possibly levels of competition maybe with other humans or carnivores. And I'm just going to sort of finish up on take your mind back to that elephant footprint site which I was talking about before. While we were cataloguing all these footprints, we happened to stumble across this very clearly early human footprint. Now we have about 8 of these. Some of these are clustered, some of these are sort of isolated. And the size range indicates that these are probably made by at least 3 individuals, possibly more. Now, like I said, we managed to date this site to about 113, 120,000 years old. Now, it's difficult, if not impossible, to determine species alone from footprint, but the size ranges place them within the sort of size range of modern humans or Neanderthals or things like that. But what I do find quite interesting is the date. I mean, we can't tell who made these prints, but just in the Levant, we have the earliest evidence of Homo sapiens out of Africa. And these people are walking around at a similar time. Furthermore, looking at the diagram down on the bottom left, we have a rose plot, and that indicates the orientation that these prints are facing. As you can see, the prints are facing all sorts of different directions. And what this tends to suggest to me is that you possibly have a small group, at least a small group, of early humans around a water source, possibly foraging, butchering, or hunting. But the analysis of the footprints is still very preliminary, and I won't go on too much about those. So sort of just in conclusion, the animals the taxa that we're identifying strongly support those paleo-environmental findings. That we have these large permanent lakes and expansive grasslands. We know that at least from the hippo, but it seems that these, when we have an increase in water availability and the establishment of these lakes, we get this influx of this taxa from both Africa and Eurasia, and it's likely that the subsequent drying resulted in faunal retreat or local extinction. And we also know now that these early humans that were in the Western Nufud Desert were butchering these animals to gain access to the marrow, but as it stands, sort of what level of resource availability and competition sort of remains unknown. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Matthew. Unfortunately, due to time constraint, there will be no questions for this session, and people who are interested to ask the presenters after the end of the session. نعتذر عن عدم إتاحة الفرصة للأسئلة لأنه لا يوجد مساحة مع الجلسة اللاحقة خلال 15 دقيقة إن شاء الله. In the name of His Royal Highness Prince Sultan bin Salman, the President of the SCTH, I'd like to present you a certificate of appreciation for presenting your papers in this session. Thank you very much.